So the class is called Superheroes and American Mythology.
Oh, there you go.
So it starts with this idea that in whatever civilization or culture, people come up with a set of stories that help them learn about the values of the society and help to transfer those values to new generations as they hand down those stories, right? So we're very familiar with Greek myths, if we grew up in the US, right? And Greek myths told people about what you're supposed to do to please the gods, what you're supposed to do to function in their society, how to be a good citizen, how to interact with other people. But that was tied up in their religious beliefs at the time, and those have changed and adapted through the years. So as Christianity becomes more popular and as science and movements that sort of splinter away from religious stories begin to become more popular as time goes on in the West, we start to tell different kinds of stories in order to pass on those values. So when printing presses first came out, the Bible was of course the first thing that people started printing, and those stories were being shared over and over and over again. And then those stories start to take new form as different kinds of media become available. So as people start writing novels, we still have outsider characters who are being unfairly treated by a mainstream society, and then that society is threatened, and the outsider has some kind of special skill that they can use to help liberate the society, and through their sacrificial battle with evil to save that society, they become accepted or reconciled somehow, right? So it's a very Christological story, but we start to see that in pulp noir, and we start to see that in westerns as movies become more popular, right? And now westerns aren't quite as popular, so where are we finding these stories? Oftentimes it's in comic books and in superhero films now. I mean, technically, yeah. Whoever gets a hold of the character can do whatever they want with the character, I guess. This is another thing that we talk about in the class, is that there's a love-hate relationship between content creators, the people who own Batman, right, and or any superhero, and the content consumers who feel like they have all of this history with the character, they've developed some kind of relationship with the character, and therefore they have expectations for how that character is going to be portrayed. So the tension here is that we as consumers need the producers to some degree, right? They're the ones putting out the content. They make the movies. They design the comics. They're the ones who are sending the content out into the world. But we often have certain things that we want, certain standards for the characters, things that we've come to expect from our history with them. So I really like Michael Keaton's Batman. I love versions of Batman that are aware that it's a little bit strange for a man to take himself that seriously and to dress up as a bat and like run around, and you know, that's a little bit odd. So some awareness of that I think is kind of fun. But there are other ways of doing the character that other people like, and I recognize that that's fine too. But some people become very, very attached, right, to their specific version, and they don't like to see other interpretations. And that can cause conflict in fandoms. That can also cause conflict with content producers. And producers have to be at least somewhat aware of fan expectations, because if the consumers stop consuming, if we don't go see the movies, if we don't buy the books, if we don't tune into the television show, they're not going to make their money back, and they're not going to be able to continue producing these products, right? So we have that relationship where, as I'm a Batman fan, so as a fan, I want people to keep making these products. but they also want me to be at least somewhat happy, so that I'll continue to fork out the money so that they can keep doing new stuff. So technically anybody who's a content producer can do their own version of a character, right? But they do so to their own peril if they're making lots and lots of changes. Their own peril, like financially.
Sure.
Right? Sometimes that can be really helpful because there may be outdated aspects of characters or new demands from fan communities, right? This most recent Batman movie, The Batman with Robert Pattinson, is far more social justice oriented than, say, Christian Bale's version of the character or Ben Affleck's version of the character. So that appeals to certain fans and maybe a little bit less to other kinds of fans. And all of this is this big tangled relationship that's not only about community and connections and affection, but also economics and marketing and the prominent values in the United States and culture clashes and things like that. So what got me into superheroes was sitting on the couch with my mom and watching Batman the Animated Series in the mid-90s. I don't think she cared all that much about Batman the Animated Series, but I did as a kid, and so she was like, okay, he likes it, we're going to watch it together, and she kind of let me pursue my interests there, which was really wonderful of her. So my interest in superheroes starts with Batman the Animated Series, and that has impacted a lot of things in my life, like my aesthetics and taste, right? It's very sort of punk and grungy, right? And that carried into especially who I was as a high schooler, but there's still traces of it now. I like a lot of things in blacks and reds and deep blues. That version of Batman was also much more of a helper, I think, than other versions of the character. He was very focused on stepping in to protect people from not only the physical harm that the villains brought, but from the psychological harms that they could do. So if there's a villain, say the Scarecrow, that character uses toxins to induce fears in people, right? So Batman is there to prevent this person from causing people to have to live in fear in their neighborhoods or whatever. So there's this really strong psychological tie. And he was also big on rehabilitating villains in that particular series, which we don't really see in film or live action television versions of that character. So all of that to say, I grew up thinking about superheroes as helpers, the people who used whatever skills that they had to help other people, right? And to me, that's the core of superhero mythology. I didn't know that I wanted to study that until I was in my mid-20s and working on a master's degree. So my undergraduate is in speech, and so I was coaching public speaking and coaching theater for local high schools for a while. And then I thought, if I really want to be great at what I do, I should probably further my education. I can maybe teach my students a little more than the average instructor. And so if I better myself, I'll be better for my students, right? And I can make them better too. So I go back to get my master's degree, and I am taking a class on teaching and philosophy of teaching, and there is so much about popular culture in that class and how people learn through the media that they're exposed to. So I spent a lot of time during my master's degree thinking about how has media influenced me, and how does media demonstrate some of the concepts that I'm teaching in my classes. And as I'm tinkering with incorporating pop culture into the speech classes that I'm teaching, I start thinking there's a lot more here with media and how it impacts our relationships and how we build community and how we build our sense of self than what I had ever thought about before. So about halfway through my master's degree, I just dive straight into that, thinking like, how does media influence the way that we develop culture, the way that we form community with others, the way that we cultivate our interpersonal relationships. And I carried that all the way through in my PhD. So when I started my doctorate, I was immediately thinking, I want to study media, I want to study how media influences us. And I became especially interested in fan communities because they're explicitly focused on how popular culture creates connections between them, right? And sometimes how pop culture can be used to divide people as well. So I have a chapter in my book that's dedicated to kind of that question, historical versions of the Joker, and then how does Joaquin Phoenix's version connect to that, and in what ways does he splinter from that, right? So there's some connection in the iconography, the symbolism that's used. So we've come to associate the clown makeup and the suit and the sort of gritty noir city environment as all belonging to the Joker. There's a trend of the Joker being associated with a kind of anarchy, kind of a tricksterish resistance to the status quo and major social systems. So all of that is in keeping with the history, I think. But there's also certain divergences. So no version of the Joker has explicitly and seriously dealt with systemic issues with treating mental health, for example. So that's something that's new for this character. Most versions of the Joker don't have a specific origin story, so giving the Joker kind of a history and a background kicks against some of the recognized canon version of the character in times past. Specifically, there's a graphic novel from Alan Moore and Brian Bolland called The Killing Joke, and in The Killing Joke, they kind of say for this character to be scary and interesting, you can't give him a backstory because he's an unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
If he tells you the backstory, you can't really believe him, right? I personally did not like the movie Joker, but I didn't like it specifically because I was aware of the ways that certain fan communities that were unfriendly and sometimes aggressive toward people who didn't look like them or think like them had responded to the movie. The major thrust of my book is that a movie like Joker doesn't mean anything by itself. It doesn't mean anything until we kind of project meaning onto it, right? So if you're someone who's a big fan of the character and you're very inclusive and you want to find messages about how the movie inspires us to take a closer look at mental health or social alienation or ways that we can be more caring and therefore prevent the creation of Joker-type characters, that's great. We can look at the movie that way. But then there are also some people who read really hurtful things onto the movie. They'll say things like, almost every black character in the movie is an obstacle or an antagonist. And you know what? That means that black people are really just holding back white people in present society, right? Now, is that an obvious message to take away from the film? Probably not, in my opinion. So the book is about how do people come to these readings, right? Obviously they have some kind of preconceived notion, but how do they convince anyone that this is an actual message that's supposedly intended in the text of the film? So I thought Joaquin Phoenix gave a great performance. I think the movie's shot and edited really well, and it looks great. But I also think the filmmakers could have been a little more aware of the history of the character and the fact that people who have very extreme views about race and about sex have historically kind of used the Joker, and it would have been helpful, I think, if the filmmakers would have explained their meaning behind the movie a little bit more, instead of doing the classic auteur thing of saying, like, it's all whatever the audience takes away is what it means. Well, if you say it can mean anything, there are some people who are going to turn it into something really ugly. So maybe giving some direction and guiding people away from the idea that this can be a super racist film would be helpful.